Hi everyone, I'm Hoda Khalil, a postdoctoral fellow at Carleton University. I'm presenting for you today my work with Professor Gabriel Weiner on modeling carbon dioxide dispersion indoors. I will show you our experiment, our model, and how we validated it. Okay, so let's start with the motivation. What made us so excited about modeling CO2 concentration or the diffusion of CO2 indoors? There are several reasons for that. First of all, measuring CO2 concentration levels indoor is essential for maintaining healthy indoor air quality, is essential for the comfort of our occupants. Also, CO2 concentration levels are used to detect occupants in closed spaces. This information is useful for demand control of lighting and ventilation to ensure efficient energy consumption in buildings. Now the problem is that understanding CO2 diffusion and how the parameters of an indoor space affect it is difficult to achieve by physical experimentation. Therefore, modeling and simulation is the solution to achieve our goals. Now, what is the methodology we are using to achieve those goals? We use cellular discrete event specification, CEL-DEVS, for its several advantages, and we use the tools supporting it. Among those advantages are asynchronous execution that allows for more efficient or better execution time. Also, CEL-DEVS gives the possibility of defining complex timing conditions. And finally, it has a wide set of supporting tools that one can use to model, to simulate, and to view the result of the simulation. More details about the advantages are available in the paper. So we use CEL-DEVS formulas and the supporting tools to model indoor spaces. The conceptual model considers different parameters of the indoor space. For example, it considers the dimensions, the height, the width, and the depth of the room, the different dimensions. It also considers CO2 sinks. CO2 sinks are areas in the model that allow CO2 concentration level to reduce. So those are the windows, open windows of course, open doors, ventilations that are, or ventilation ports that actually work. Also in the model we represent CO2 sources. Those are occupants, people that are present in the indoor space and producing CO2 because of breathing. Now for the setup that we used for our experiment. One of the tools that support CEL-DEVS as a formalism is CEL-DEVS Cadmium, which is a cross-platform header-only C++ library that can be used to implement and simulate CEL-DEVS model. So the generic model of CO2 dispersion is implemented in C++, while the specific configurations of the room and the details of each model are scenarios. Those scenarios are written in JavaScript object notation, JSON files, and those files are parsed by the simulator to simulate the model. For the visualization of our results, we use ARSLab Visualizer. So what's in the general model and what's in the scenario? The general model has the computations, the cell types, the meat of the model, the things that are generic. So how do we compute the different states of each cell? What are the cell types that this model can handle? On the other hand, the scenarios have things that are specific for each indoor space. So specifically, what are the cell types that can be handled by our general model and how their state is calculated, how the computation happened for each cell? We have 7 cell types. We have obstacles and walls, those we call impermeable structures, and those are constant. CO2 does not go through them, so they do not affect the concentration of the area around them. And we have doors, windows, and vents. Doors have constant ambient indoor CO2 level from the rest of the building. And we have a default value of 500 particles ppm. Windows also have constant outdoor CO2 level that is lower than the indoor. And the logic is that they're constant because, for example, if you have an open door in a space, the high CO2 concentration of that space does not affect the concentration in the large outside space. However, the windows allow fresh air to go inside and thus would lower the concentration in the indoor space. Vents also have constant CO2 level that is lower than the windows. However, the concentration level at the vents, or this constant concentration level, can be read from the JSON for different settings of different indoor spaces. And then we have air, workstations, and CO2 sources. For those, there is a little bit more complex way of calculating the CO2 level. They're not constant. They are affected by their neighbors. So how the computations are done on those cells? Let's start here with air cells and workstations. The CO2 concentration levels in air cells and workstations are done through averaging based on this concentration on the neighborhood. So if we have a more neighborhood, for example, in a 3D space, this means that we have 27 cells in the neighborhood, and the concentration on those cells are averaged to produce the concentration in the second level. However, impermeable structures are excluded from this calculation, from the averaging. Now, what if the cell is a workstation? For a workstation, again, the concentration level is calculated the same way as in the air cells. However, a workstation represents a place where an occupant may occur. So in a laboratory, for example, that would be the places where the computers are installed, and most probably students would exist in those spaces. In a living room, those are chairs where occupants may arrive and sit and breathe. So for those workstations, they switch to be occupied after different periods of times to represent the variable arrival of occupants. Occupants may arrive at different times. So when an occupant arrives, the workstation cell switches to be a CO2 source. And the way the CO2 concentration level is calculated changes based on that. The CO2 concentration is added at intervals based on the breathing rate that is read from the JSON. So if the settings in the JSON scenario suggest that this is a classroom where occupants have normal activity level, for example, we calculate the CO2 increase based on that. So every 5 seconds, we calculate the new CO2 concentration based on the CO2 production by the occupant and the physical volume occupied by the person and represented by one cell in the model space. Then we convert the increase in concentration to be in the unit particle per million, ppm, which is the unit used for measuring CO2 concentration. Then, when the occupant leaves the space, the CO2 cells becomes again a workstation. Then for this cell, we stop adding CO2 because the CO2 level and it starts decreasing again based on the effect of other CO2 sinks in the room. So now that we know the general model and how things are computed, we move to the scenarios, the specific scenarios. We used one scenario for calibrating and another scenario for validating the data of our model. We have ground truth data of both scenarios. It is representative of a real physical space of 2 computer laboratories. They were in the same building but in 2 different floors. And what we see here is the floor plan of the laboratory with this is the key. So white spaces are just air cells, yellow are windows, green is the door, and the blue squares are ventilation ports. And then we have the furniture layout. The chairs show where the occupants may occur. And then we have the physical dimensions. And we know that we had 13 during the lab period that we represent in the model, which lasted for 2 hours. We had 39 students and 1 TA. Students arrived and left at different rates. Now this is the translation of the physical space into a cell DEVS model. This is a cross-section of the model on the level where the CO2 sensors exist and where the people will be seated. So that is between this cross-section is represents the area from 120 centimeters height to 160 centimeters height, because in the model, as I will explain in a minute, we use cell size of 40 centimeter by 40 centimeter by 40 centimeter. And the rectangle on the left will show you in the simulation results the concentration levels, the CO2 concentration levels, while the rectangle on the right is the seatings and the occupants. So the red squares are occupied workstations and the gray squares are empty workstations. So we calibrated this model, meaning that we had some settings that we know for sure. Those we did not change. And we have some settings that we were not sure of. The exact arrival of occupants, the concentration level in the vents, for example. So those we played a bit with so that we can reach data from the model that are very similar to the ground truth data that we know. And then we use this calibrated model to make sure the settings that we achieved here with another model to make sure that our model is valid with another scenario, I mean. So the settings that we knew were there for sure of the floor plan. We know the room, the dimensions, we know the floor plan. And we know the dimensions, so we converted the dimensions into cells based on using 40 centimeter cells, 40 by 40 by 40, because this is usually the area that is occupied by one occupant, regardless of the empty space around that occupant. So we used 40 centimeter by 40 centimeter by 40 centimeter cells. And we used neighborhood more because we wanted to include all the surrounding cells in the calculation. And we used the normal breathing rate for usual activity level, which is 5 seconds between each exhalation. And then we know that the number of students were 39. Whether the TA was available throughout the time or not, this is something that we were not sure of. So when we tried several scenarios, we found that the one that produced something similar to real data was that the TA was available throughout. And then we tried again several scenarios, and the original concentration before the arrival of the first occupant was the best case 690. The CO2 concentration per breath, again, we knew that it was based on research. When we do office work, based on the literature, it's 0.31 liter per minute per person, which is 0.026 ppm per liter per breath. So, but we experimented a bit with this to make sure that nothing affected this, and the normal office work rate was the rate that produced results similar to the real life data. Then this is something that we usually the default of the ventilation level is lower than this, but when we experimented with the model, the vents ventilation were between 650 and 680 ppm. And then occupants arrival time. This is a very time-consuming process, but we had to change the way occupants arrive to find a pattern that produced results similar to a physical system. And the door was closed throughout the simulation, and the vents we know that they were on. Okay, so how this model works, how the simulation results look like. I will show you a short video here. We have here the concentration, the legend or the concentration level that we use. The colors that we use are from dark blue up to dark red as the concentration increases up to 1000 ppm in here. And we see here in the middle rectangle occupants are arriving by one, and the CO2 concentration is changing based on that. So the area where the occupants are concentrated has higher CO2 levels, and we know that the CO2 sensors are installed close to the door, so we log the results of the model based on that, and we saw that it becomes darker as the simulation time increases. So this is the data that we found from the model, that we logged from the model. On the right, this is the CO2 concentration level in ppm from the model, and on the left, this is the CO2 concentration in the ground truth data, and we saw that the calibration produced very similar results in both. So next, we move to our second scenario. We use the data that we use the settings that we concluded from the calibration model in the validation scenario. So this is another room, different settings, different dimensions, and different floor. And it has we're using the same key here. The squares, the blue squares are ventilation ports, and we have the floor plan and everything. So we use the settings that we achieved to simulate the CO2 concentration change in this model. This is the ground truth data. We know that the CO2 concentration is increasing in this pattern as occupants arrive. The difference here is that occupants do not leave at the end of the lab. Other occupants arrive at the same time, and we reflected this in the model. The number of students was much lower, only 10 students, and the dimensions of the room, as we mentioned, was different. Now we used the data that we reached by calibrating the model, the same settings that we reached by the calibration in the validation model, except of course for the floor plan and the number of occupants that we know that were different than the calibration model. This video shows part of the simulation results of the validation model and how the CO2 concentration on the left changes based on the arrival and departure of occupants. However, the increase here is lower than the previous model because the number of occupants are way less relative to the space. This is the data logged from the model on the right side. And on the left side, we have the ground truth data. And again, we have very similar results, which prove that our calibration worked, and the model shows results or data that is very similar to the ground truth data. This brings us to our conclusion. So, motivated by the need for modeling CO2 dispersion indoor, we used cell DEVS formalism and cadmium simulator to model CO2 dispersion in closed spaces. We used real-life physical scenarios to calibrate and validate our model. The results showed resemblance with ground truth data. In future models, we plan to include airflow direction in our models for more realistic modeling. Finally, I would like to thank you very much for listening, and I will be happy to answer your questions in the question period.